Imagine driving home after a long, exhausting day. The road is quiet, the night is calm, and all you want is to reach home and rest. But suddenly, flashing red and blue lights explode in your rearview mirror. Your heart skips a beat. You check your speed. You check the road. You didn't break any law. Still, the police car keeps following you. The siren blares. You slowly pull your car to the side of the road, wondering one thing in your mind. Why me? Two officers step out of their patrol car. Their footsteps echo on the empty highway as they approach your window. Their tone is cold. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation. Just authority. You hand over your documents calmly, but something feels wrong. The questions start coming fast. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Why are you acting nervous? Before you can even understand what's happening, they order you out of the car. Drivers passing by slow down to watch. Some even start recording. The officers search your vehicle, your belongings, your briefcase. They treat you like a criminal, like you're hiding something, like you don't deserve respect. But what these officers don't know, what they never imagined, is that the quiet man standing beside the car, the man they're humiliating on the side of the road, is not just another driver. He is someone whose job is to investigate police misconduct, someone whose authority could change their entire careers. And when the officers finally discover who he really is, the entire situation changes in a way they never expected. Confidence turns into silence. Authority turns into fear. And the same officers who were shouting orders just moments ago suddenly realize they may have made the biggest mistake of their lives. But the most powerful moment of this story isn't about revenge. It's about a lesson about power, about respect, and about how the way you treat someone today might come back to define your future tomorrow. So what exactly happened during that traffic stop? How did a simple roadside encounter turn into a moment these officers would never forget? And what did the mysterious driver say that left them completely speechless? Stay with me, because this story will change the way you look at authority, respect, and justice forever. Flashing red and blue lights suddenly lit up the dark highway, cutting to the quiet evening like a warning signal no driver could ignore. Inside a black sedan driving steadily down the road was a man named Daniel Carter. He was in his mid-40s, neatly dressed in a dark suit, his posture calm and composed as he kept both hands on the steering wheel. The road ahead was mostly empty, and the soft glow of streetlights reflected on the smooth surface of the asphalt. Daniel had been driving for nearly 30 minutes, heading home after a long and exhausting day. His mind was filled with thoughts about work, meetings, and responsibilities waiting for him the next morning. But suddenly, in his rearview mirror, he saw something that made him sigh quietly. Police lights. The red and blue flashes grew brighter as the patrol car quickly closed the distance behind him. Daniel checked his speed instinctively. He was driving exactly at the speed limit. He hadn't crossed any lanes. He hadn't used his phone. He hadn't broken any traffic rules. Still, the police car remained behind him, lights flashing aggressively. A moment later, the loud siren echoed across the empty road. Daniel knew what that meant. He slowly signaled and carefully pulled his car to the side of the road. The tires rolled gently onto the shoulder as the sedan came to a complete stop. For a moment, the only sound was a hum of passing wind and the flashing lights reflecting off the car windows. Daniel took a calm breath. Traffic stops were never pleasant, but he had nothing to hide. Behind him, the patrol car door opened. Two officers stepped out. Officer Jenkins was the first to approach. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with the kind of confidence that suggested he enjoyed being in control. His partner, Officer Miller, followed closely behind, scanning the area with a flashlight. Their footsteps echoed lightly on the pavement as they approached the stopped vehicle. Jenkins knocked sharply on the driver's window. Daniel calmly rolled it down. License and registration, Jenkins said immediately, his voice firm and demanding. Daniel nodded politely and reached for his wallet. "Of course, officer." He handed over the documents without hesitation. Jenkins looked at the license briefly, but didn't seem very interested in reading it carefully. Instead, his eyes moved back to Daniel. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. From downtown, Daniel replied calmly. And where you going? Home. Jenkins leaned slightly closer to the window, studying Daniel's face as if searching for something suspicious. You were driving kind of strange back there, Jenkins said. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, but kept his voice respectful. I was just driving normally. Officer Miller had already moved to the passenger side of the car. His flashlight beam moved slowly across the dashboard, the seats, and the back of the vehicle. The bright light filled the car's interior, making the situation feel even more tense. Daniel noticed a few cars passing by slowly, drivers curious about the stop. Traffic stops always attracted attention. But what made the situation uncomfortable was the tone of the officers. Jenkins spoke again. You nervous? He asked suddenly. Daniel shook his head. No, officer. Jenkins crossed his arms. People usually get nervous when they're hiding something. Daniel stayed calm. I'm not hiding anything. For a moment, the two men stared at each other silently. Then Jenkins stepped back and spoke again. Step out of the vehicle. The command came quickly and without explanation. Daniel paused for a brief moment. He knew his rights, but he also understood that arguing on the roadside rarely helped. So he opened the door slowly and stepped out. The cool evening air hit his face as he stood beside his car. Officer Miller walked around the vehicle slowly, still shining the flashlight through the windows. Nice car, Miller muttered casually. Daniel gave a small nod. Thank you. But the officer's behavior didn't feel like a normal routine check. Jenkins circled around Daniel, like he was studying him carefully. What do you do for work? Jenkins asked. Daniel answered simply, I work in public service. Jenkins smirked slightly. That's a pretty vague answer. Daniel didn't react to the tone. I handle investigations. The answer seemed to make Jenkins even more curious. He looked toward Miller. Check the car. Without asking for permission or explaining the reason, Miller opened the back door of the sedan and began looking inside. Daniel watched silently. He could already tell the situation was becoming something more than a simple traffic stop. The flashlight beam moved across the back seat, stopping on a leather briefcase resting beside a stack of papers. Miller picked it up. What's in here? He asked. Work documents, Daniel replied calmly. But Jenkins wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer and placed a hand on the roof of the car. Mind if we take a look? He asked, though his tone made it sound less like a question and more like a decision that had already been made. Daniel looked at the officers for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Go ahead. Miller placed a briefcase on the hood of the patrol car and opened it. Inside were organized folders, a laptop, and several official-looking documents. But neither officer yet realized the importance of what they were looking at. Instead, Jenkins continued questioning Daniel. So, he said slowly, you investigate things? Yes. Jenkins smiled slightly. Well, tonight, he said, we're the ones doing the investigating. Daniel simply stood there quietly. Cars continued passing by. The flashing police lights reflected across the road, and neither officer had the slightest idea that the man they were questioning was someone who could completely change their careers. The flashing police lights continued to glow against the dark highway, creating long reflections across the pavement. Daniel Carter stood quietly beside his car, his hands relaxed at his sides, watching the officers carefully. Officer Miller had already begun searching through the interior of the vehicle. His flashlight moved slowly across the seats, the floor, and the center console, as if he expected to find something suspicious hidden somewhere inside. Daniel kept his voice calm. Officer, he said politely, may I ask why my car is being searched? Officer Jenkins turned toward him with a slightly irritated expression. Routine check, he replied quickly. Daniel nodded slightly, but he knew something about the situation didn't feel routine. Normally, officers explained their reasons clearly during a traffic stop, but Jenkins seemed more interested in asserting authority than giving explanations. Miller opened the back door of the sedan wider and leaned inside. He moved a few papers aside and looked beneath the seats. Jenkins walked around the car slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on Daniel. You said you work in investigations? Jenkins said. Yes, Daniel replied calmly. What kind of investigations? Daniel gave a short answer. Internal matters. Jenkins narrowed his eyes slightly. That's still pretty vague. Daniel simply stood quietly. He had no reason to reveal more information than necessary. Meanwhile, Miller suddenly spoke from the other side of the car. "Hey, Jenkins." He lifted the leather briefcase from the back seat. "What's this?" Daniel answered calmly. "My work briefcase." Miller carried it over the hood of a patrol car and placed it down. Jenkins walked over beside him. "Mind if we take a look inside?" he asked again, though the way he spoke made it clear he had already decided. Daniel looked at the briefcase and then back at the officers. "Go ahead," he said calmly. Miller opened the briefcase, slowly. Inside were several folders, neatly arranged documents, and a slim silver laptop. Everything was organized carefully, showing the habits of someone who took their work seriously. But Jenkins barely glanced at the papers before turning his attention to Daniel. "So let me guess," Jenkins said sarcastically. "Businessman? Lawyer?" Daniel simply shook his head slightly. "No." Jenkins crossed his arms again. "You're awfully calm for someone getting pulled over and searched." Daniel answered honestly. "I know I've done nothing wrong." Jenkins let out a small laugh. "That's what they all say." A car drove past slowly, its driver clearly watching the scene. The flashing police lights made it impossible not to notice what was happening on the side of the road. Some drivers slowed down even more. Curious about the situation, Officer Miller began flipping through the folders inside the briefcase. Most of the documents were neatly printed reports, forms, and official-looking paperwork. But he wasn't paying much attention to the details yet. Instead, he looked up toward Daniel. "What exactly were you doing downtown tonight?" Miller asked. "Work," Daniel replied. "What kind of work happens this late?" Daniel answered calmly. "Important work." Jenkins smirked again. "Sound mysterious." The officer seemed determined to make the situation uncomfortable. Jenkins suddenly stepped closer to Daniel. "You nervous yet?" he asked. Daniel looked directly at him. "No." Jenkins tilted his head slightly. "You should be." Daniel remained silent. The tension on the roadside continued to grow. The flashing lights, the empty highway, and the late hour made the situation feel even more intense. Miller continued examining the briefcase. He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the hood of the patrol car. "What's this report about?" he asked casually. Daniel glanced briefly at the folder, but did not step closer. "Just documents related to investigations." Jenkins leaned over the folder, but didn't bother reading the title carefully. Instead, he continued questioning Daniel. "You got any weapons in the car?" Jenkins asked. "No." "Any illegal items?" "No." Jenkins looked toward Miller. "Check the trunk." Miller nodded and walked toward the back of the sedan. He opened the trunk and began looking inside. There was nothing unusual. Just a spare tire, a small toolkit, and a neatly folded jacket. "Nothing back here," Miller said. But Jenkins still didn't seem satisfied. He walked back toward the patrol car and looked again at the briefcase full of documents. "You carry a lot of paperwork for someone who says they're just heading home," Jenkins said. Daniel remained calm. "I came directly from work." Jenkins tapped the folder lightly with his finger. "What kind of investigations are these exactly?" Daniel answered carefully. "Professional ones." Miller suddenly picked up another document from inside the briefcase. This one looked different. It had a bold official header printed across the top. Miller paused. For the first time since the search began, he actually started reading the document more carefully. His expression changed slightly. "Hey, Jenkins," he said slowly. Jenkins didn't look up right away. "What?" Miller continued staring at the page. "This looks official." Jenkins rolled his eyes slightly. "Of course it's official. Didn't he say it was work stuff?" But Miller's face looked more serious now. "This isn't just paperwork," he said quietly. Jenkins finally turned his head. "What are you talking about?" Miller held up the document slightly so Jenkins could see it. At the top of the page was an official government seal, and directly beneath it was a name. Jenkins stepped closer, still looking confident. But the moment his eyes read the full title printed on the document, the confidence on his face slowly began to disappear. He blinked once. Then he looked again to make sure he wasn't reading it wrong. The name matched the driver's license they had barely glanced at earlier, Daniel Carter. But the title next to the name changed everything. And suddenly, this traffic stop no longer felt like a situation the officers were in control of. For a few seconds, Officer Miller just stared at the document in his hands. The flashing red and blue lights from a patrol car reflected across the page, making the official seal shine under the dim streetlights. Miller's confident expression slowly faded as his eyes moved across the bold letters printed at the top. Something about the document was different from the rest. This wasn't just a normal report. Miller read the line again, slower this time. His eyebrows tightened. "Jenkins," he said quietly. Officer Jenkins was still standing near Daniel, arms crossed, looking completely confident. To him, this traffic stop was still under his control. "What?" Jenkins replied impatiently. Miller lifted the paper slightly. "This doesn't look like normal paperwork." Jenkins sighed and walked over toward the patrol car. "Everything looks official when people try to look important," he muttered. But the moment Jenkins leaned closer and read the document himself, his voice stopped. His eyes moved from the official seal to the name printed clearly beneath it, Daniel Carter. Then his gaze dropped to the title printed next to the name. For a moment, Jenkins didn't speak. He blinked once, as if trying to make sure he wasn't reading it wrong. Then he leaned closer again. His expression began to change. The confident smirk he had been wearing all evening slowly disappeared. Officer Miller noticed it immediately. "What is it?" Miller asked. Jenkins swallowed slightly. "Wait a second." He flipped the page over, searching for more details. The folder contained identification papers, authorization documents, and official investigation reports. And each page confirmed the same thing. Daniel Carter was not just some random driver they had stopped. He was Chief Daniel Carter, the newly appointed head of the city's Internal Affairs Division, the department responsible for investigating police misconduct. A quiet wave of realization hit both officers at the same time. Miller slowly looked up from the document. His eyes shifted toward Daniel, who was still standing calmly beside his car, watching everything. The calm expression on Daniel's face suddenly made much more sense. Jenkins slowly lowered the document. For the first time since the traffic stop began, he looked unsure of himself. "You," Jenkins said carefully, looking toward Daniel. Daniel remained silent. "You're Chief Carter?" Jenkins finally asked. Daniel nodded calmly. "Yes." The answer was simple, but the effect it had on the officers was immediate. Officer Miller straightened his posture instantly. The casual attitude he had earlier disappeared completely. The same officer who had been searching the car without concern now looked noticeably nervous. Miller quickly began placing the documents back into the folder carefully. I didn't realize, sir," Miller said. Jenkins cleared his throat awkwardly. "We were just doing a routine stop," he added quickly. Daniel looked at them quietly for a moment. The flashing police lights continued to reflect off the cars passing by on the highway. Several drivers were still slowing down to watch the situation unfold. But now the power dynamic on the roadside had completely shifted. Just minutes earlier, the officers had treated Daniel like a suspicious driver. Now they were standing in front of the very person whose job was to investigate officers who abused their authority. Daniel took a slow breath. "You didn't ask who I was," he said calmly. Neither officer replied. Miller closed the briefcase carefully and placed it back on the hood of the patrol car. The confident energy that had filled the stop earlier had completely disappeared. Jenkins shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Well, sir," he said carefully, "you have to understand, we were just following procedure." Daniel looked directly at him. "Procedure?" His tone wasn't angry, but it was firm. Jenkins hesitated. "You ordered me out of my car," Daniel continued calmly. "You searched my vehicle without explaining a reason." Neither officer said anything. The truth was clear. They had assumed Daniel was just another driver they could intimidate. Daniel glanced briefly at the briefcase sitting on the patrol car. "You didn't even look at the documents before questioning me," he added. Miller's face grew slightly red. He knew that was true. If he had read the first page earlier, the entire situation would have ended very differently. Another car passed slowly on the highway. Someone inside appeared to be recording the scene with a phone. Jenkins noticed it and suddenly seemed even more uncomfortable. "Sir, we didn't mean any disrespect," he said. Daniel studied both officers carefully. Years of experience investigating police behavior had taught him how to read situations like this. He had seen this pattern many times before. Officers becoming overly aggressive during simple stops, assuming they had full control, forgetting that every driver deserved respect. Daniel finally spoke again. "You know what internal affairs does, right?" Miller nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Daniel looked toward Jenkins. "It investigates complaints against officers." The silence that followed fell heavy. Jenkins slowly nodded. "Yes, sir." Daniel glanced briefly at the road, then back at them. "Tonight," he said calmly, "you treated me like I was guilty before you knew anything about me." Neither officer could argue with that, because it was exactly what had happened. Daniel then said something that made the moment even more uncomfortable. "Imagine if I were just a regular citizen." Both officers remained silent, because they knew the answer. They had treated him exactly like that. And now they were standing face to face with the man responsible for making sure officers followed the law. The flashing police lights continued to spin behind them, but now the officers weren't standing there with authority. They were standing there with the realization that this simple traffic stop might turn into something much bigger than they ever expected. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The flashing red and blue lights on the patrol car continued spinning silently, reflecting across the dark highway and the side of Daniel Carter's black sedan. Cars passed occasionally, slowing down as drivers tried to understand what was happening on the roadside. But the atmosphere had completely changed. Just minutes earlier, Officers Jenkins and Miller had been confident, almost arrogant. They had spoken sharply, questioned Daniel aggressively, and searched his car as if they were certain he was hiding something. Now, they stood quietly in front of him. The same man they had treated like a suspect was now revealed to be Chief Daniel Carter, the head of Internal Affairs, the division responsible for investigating police misconduct. Officer Miller cleared his throat softly. "Sir, we really didn't know who you were," he said nervously. Daniel looked at him calmly. "I noticed," he replied. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried a calm authority that made both officers even more uncomfortable. Officer Jenkins shifted his weight slightly, clearly unsure what to say next. "We were just trying to do our job," he added carefully. Daniel studied both officers for a moment before speaking again. "Doing your job," he said slowly, "means enforcing the law while respecting the people you interact with." Neither officer responded, because they both knew the truth. That wasn't what had happened tonight. Daniel walked over to the patrol car and picked up his briefcase from the hood. He brushed a bit of dust from the leather surface before closing it carefully. The simple movement made the officers even more nervous. They didn't know what he was thinking. They didn't know what would happen next. Years of police training had taught them many things, but one lesson stood out clearly in this moment. Internal affairs investigations could end careers. Daniel placed the briefcase back in the backseat of his car, and then turned back toward them. "You know," he said calmly, "most people you stop on the road don't have the authority to question your behavior." The officers remained silent. "But that doesn't mean they deserve to be treated any differently," Daniel continued. His words were calm, but each sentence carried weight. Officer Miller lowered his eyes slightly. "Sir, we apologize if we made you uncomfortable." Daniel shook his head slightly. "This isn't about making me uncomfortable." The officers looked back up. "This is about how officers treat ordinary citizens every day," Daniel said. Those words hit harder than either officer expected, because they both knew that Daniel was right. If he had just been a normal driver, the situation likely would have continued exactly the same way. Daniel looked toward the road for a moment as another car passed by. "I actually spent the entire afternoon in meetings," he said. The officers listened carefully. Meetings about complaints involving traffic stops. Officer Jenkins felt his stomach tighten slightly. Complaints about traffic stops were one of the most common issues Internal Affairs investigated, and tonight they had just given the chief investigator a first-hand example. Daniel looked back at them. "Do you know what most of those complaints have in common?" he asked. Neither officer answered. "People feel disrespected, Daniel said. His voice remained calm and steady. They feel like officers assume they're guilty before even asking a question. Officer Miller nodded slowly. He could see the truth in those words. Daniel wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening them. But his calm explanation made the moment even more powerful. I've reviewed hundreds of cases, Daniel continued. In many of them, the problem wasn't the stop itself. He paused for a moment. It was the attitude. The officers stood silently. The flashing police lights continued spinning behind them, casting long shadows across the pavement. Daniel took a step closer. Tonight, you assumed I was hiding something. Neither officer denied it. You searched my vehicle without explaining why, Daniel continued. You questioned me as if I was already guilty. The silence between them felt heavy. Officer Jenkins finally spoke again. Sir, we understand. Daniel studied him carefully. Do you? Jenkins nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Daniel's expression softened slightly. Good. He glanced toward the patrol car one more time before speaking again. Because the next person you stop might not be someone who can hold you accountable. Those words stayed in the air for a moment. The officers understood exactly what he meant. Most drivers didn't have the authority of internal affairs. Most drivers couldn't challenge the behavior of police officers, which meant the responsibility for fairness rested entirely on the officers themselves. Daniel turned toward his car. Before opening the door, he paused and looked back at them one last time. Remember something, he said. Both officers stood straight. Power doesn't come from the badge, Daniel said calmly. It comes from how responsibly you use it. Neither officer forgot those words. Daniel opened the car door and sat down inside the sedan. The engine started quietly. For a moment, the headlights illuminated the empty stretch of road ahead. Daniel rolled down the window one final time. I hope tonight helps you understand why people file complaints, he said. Officer Miller nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Officer Jenkins did the same. We understand. Daniel gave a small nod. Then he slowly drove away, merging back onto the dark highway. The red and blue lights on the patrol car continued flashing behind him. But this time, the officers weren't focused on the road. They were standing silently beside their vehicle, thinking about everything that had just happened. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the moments when you least expect them. And that traffic stop was a lesson neither officer would ever forget.